So, everyone, sorry for the delay. So I'm going to introduce you to the Apollo program as we are celebrating the 50 years of Apollo 8 tonight. So a quick history context and how we went on the moon with Apollo with the programs that were right before. So once upon a time, there was a very, very cool time that was called the Cold War, when the space race was like the best thing ever. And we got to go on the moon at that time. So don't get me wrong, I know the Cold War isn't really cool, but if there wasn't the Cold War, all of this stuff wouldn't have happened. So quick context about the space race. The space race started on October 4th, 1957 with the launch of the first Earth orbit satellite called Sputnik by the Soviet Union. A month later, Sputnik 2 was also on Earth orbit, but with on board the first living thing, Laika, who was a dog. You probably all know about Laika. Have you heard of it? Yeah. So there's really cool stuff about this, but uncool stuff like actually the Soviet Union claimed that she lived for like a week, but actually she lived for like a few hours because of overheating. Then on January 31 in 1958, you have the launch of the American orbit satellite called Explorer 1, which discovered the Van Allen radiation belt around Earth. A lot of people think that the Apollo program was the first program to send things on the moon, but actually there was a Soviet program called the Lunar program, were the first program to go orbit the moon and land safely on the moon. So it wasn't the Americans, but the Soviet Union. On April 12, 1967, the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin. So there's a really cool thing happening called Yuri's Night every year on the 12th of April. Last year was in Zurich, and I've heard that this year is going to be in Lucerne, so if you want to go, it's a really cool thing to do. Then, on June 16, 1963, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. So lots of things here, achievements about the Soviet Union and not so much about the USA. And then, on 1965, the first spacewalk performed by Alexei Leonov was actually coming to Switzerland very soon in Bern for the Starmus. Yeah, right, Starmus. So if you don't want to miss it as well. There was a very tragic year during the space race in 1967 with the death of the Apollo 1 crew and the death also of a cosmonaut due to problems with a parachute on Sputnik. And also the death of 2 American astronauts due to a plane crash and a car accident. So this year was a very terrible year for space exploration. But the space race ended on July 20, 1969 with the first man on the moon, and it was officially won by the Americans. So here I've talked about the Soviet Union, but I'm going to talk about more of the Americans next. So what it takes to go on the moon. So this is a cool graph that shows how much the Cold War was great. Because during the Cold War in the 60s, you can see that NASA budget was up to 4.5% of the federal budget of the USA against like less of 0.5 nowadays and maybe even less with the new president. So yeah, that's what it takes, and that's billions of dollars that we talk about, and that's what it takes to go to the moon, and that's what limiting us today to go on Mars or to go on the moon. So this is very, very famous speech about Kennedy, when he says, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal we serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept and willing to postpone, and which we intend to win, and the others too. So that's really the start of the Apollo program. And if you talk to any astronaut, they're going to tell you that this piece is really famous because it carries lots of emotions at the time, and that what began space exploration. But for the Apollo program, there were 2 very important programs called the Mercury and the Gemini program. So the Project Mercury is very famous because it was the first group of Americans selected, known as the 7 Originals. The program put the first American in space. There were 6 space flights, and the third one by John Glenn in 1962 was the first American on orbit around Earth. two types of rockets were used. So the Western Mercury was used for the two first flights, which were suborbital, so just going up and down. And then you have the Atlas Mercury for the last 4 flights, so going in orbit around the Earth. So here's a cool picture of the astronauts. So they don't really seem real, but they're real. So the first mission is Alan Shepard right here, who flew on Freedom 7 and was also the commander on Apollo 14 and got to step on the moon. Second one, Gus Grissom, was Liberty Bell 7, and third one, John Glenn, Friendship 7, first American to orbit Earth. And there's also a really cool movie called, in French, Figure de l'ombre. I don't know if you've heard it, but it's really cool. Hidden Figures, thanks. Fourth flight by Scott Carpenter over Well 7. Fifth flight, Wadi Shira, Sigma 7. Sixth flight, Gordon Cooper, Faith 7. They actually all chose their mission's name. They chose what was going before 7, and 7 was for the 7 originals. And the last one, Dick Slayton, actually never flown on Mercury due to health problems, but he flew on Apollo 3 as test problems. Plus also the 3 originals we often forget. So Sam, Ham, and Enos, who were very important for the safety of the astronauts before launch. Sam flew on a suborbital flight on Little Joe, which wasn't a Mercury rocket. Ham flew on a suborbital on Western Mercury, and Enos on orbital on Atlas. So they all came back to Earth and they were good. Not like Laika. Then we often forget this program, but it's really important. That's what we call the bridge to the moon, and it's the Gemini program. So as Gene Cernan, an astronaut of Gemini 9, says, every flight was a new endeavor. Every flight was a challenge. I thought my flight was a failure, but it turns out we learned a great deal that allowed us to move forward and eventually be successful at walking on the moon. This symbolized the program because it was, well, a challenge, as he says, because no one ever done that, and it was very important in order to develop the technologies in order to go to the moon. It was a test on astronauts' ability to fly long durations missions, like 2-week stops, understand how spacecraft could work and rendezvous and dock in orbits. That's really essential for the Apollo missions, like docking with a lunar module, rendezvous around the moon, and also perfect re-entry and landing methods. There were lots of achievements. So first of all, the Gemini capsule was powered by Titan, as you can see here. And it was the first Americans walking in space, so after Alexei Leonov. And here you have a really fun picture of Ed White, was the first American to walk in space on June the 3rd, 1965. And there's a really cool thing that he said, that apparently the time that Houston told him to go back into the capsule after walking was the saddest moment of his life. It was also the first successful docking by Gemini 8. So this a very cool video I want to show you about the 50 years of Apollo 7. So, yeah.
Four, 3, 2, we have ignition. Commit liftoff. We have liftoff.
When I look back to there was a period of time when our crew, it's Wally Schraub, Don Isley, and myself. When we got assigned to a crew, it was going to be the second Apollo mission. And the first Apollo mission was Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. We had the same kind of spacecraft.
I'm taking over a mission that my buddy was not able to fly. That was a tough one. So with that, we went through a lot of trauma. Gus would be the first person to say, let's get on with it, do good work. And that was the kind of attitude I had going into Apollo.
Apollo 7 became very important. If we had not had a success on Apollo 7, we really don't know what would have happened to the space program.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
What happened with Apollo was an amazing series of events. We're trying to get to the moon before this decade is out. If you remember what Mr. Kennedy told us.
We were smart enough to realize that going into space is different than just going up to 40,000 feet, going supersonic, none of those kind of things. And that's what appealed to us. I think that we wanted to be part of that.
We didn't mind working 80 hours a week, because we knew we were going to do something different.
Apollo 7 was in Earth orbit for 11 days. Today I would tell people about this. That was the longest, it was the most ambitious, and the most successful first test flight of any new flying machine ever. And it's still true today, 50 years later.
In its complexity and its application, that it has never been duplicated. That happened, 2 generations ago.
What made it work was the teamwork that developed and the understanding of who was responsible for what.
We as a team worked, everyone worked, so it showed that equality was necessary. We learned so much in science, space technology, computers much smaller, semiconductors. All of this was from a space program.
Back then the objective was to get there. Now our objective is to stay there. We're going to go with a sustainable architecture.
The next frontier is going to have to be Mars. And there will come a time when humans will go to Mars.
Given a clear goal, I think humanity can accomplish anything.
Yeah, those are surely wise words. So yeah, you notice maybe that we went from Apollo 1 to directly Apollo 7. That's because the Apollo 2 to Apollo 6 missions were actually unmanned missions due to the Apollo 1 disaster. So that was the next Apollo launch that was with people inside actually. So this was their 50th birthday last year, but today we're celebrating the anniversary of Apollo 8, and for this anniversary I'm calling on stage Martin Arnell, that you have to call Maman for the night if you want to ask any questions, otherwise she won't answer. And thank you for listening, have a good night.
So, thank you. Chloe only gave me something like 12 minutes to go from the Earth to the Moon, so we're going to try to do that all together. I can't see you, it's amazing. So do you want to go for a trip around the Moon? Okay. So the reason why I want to present Apollo 8 is because it's the 50th anniversary in December, and I hope I'm going to give you a good reason to celebrate Christmas this year. So when you look up at the moon for Christmas, I hope you will think about Apollo 8. All right? And here's one of the reasons. Wait, you've taken out something or something. Okay, whatever. It doesn't matter. This movie came out recently, and it's called The First Man or something like that. I don't know if some of you guys have seen it. And Apollo, Hollywood has managed once again to squish the entire Apollo missions into one single man, Ryan Gosling. And that's not fair. And it's not fair to the entire Apollo missions. And I want to give credit tonight to the Apollo guys, which were Borman, Lovell, and Anders, because they are the first guys that went away from the neighborhood of the Earth to go towards a new, well, not new, of course, but a celestial object. And that was absolutely amazing. So, before we start, I'd like to give you a feel of 1968. It was an awful year. really, really bad. So in America, we had a lot of violence. People were demonstrating against the Vietnam War, asking for equal rights, which is perfectly fine. And there was a lot of riots on the streets, a lot of blood. A lot of blood also with Martin Luther King, who was shot, and Robert Kennedy, who was also shot. And of course, as Chloe said, the Cold War and the race to the moon. And the Soviet Union was winning, as Chloe said earlier on. The Soviet Union was winning, and the Americans had to do something about it. Intelligence also reported that the Soviet Union was about to bring people on the moon. And that really scared NASA. And they had to shuffle around their entire program, actually. They had planned with Apollo 7 to test the command module. And then after, the next mission was to test the lunar module and with the command module. And actually in the summer of 1968, the lunar module, as you could see here, was absolutely not ready. And so it was sent back to the producer. I got him. That was sorry, Claude. He's my favorite astronaut. Well, actually, I won't need it for this mission. So it's going to stay here on Earth, and George Low comes with some. So I was there, and I have another slide to show you just before I talk about George Low, who was the first living being to go around the moon. Does anybody know? It was a Russian turtle. So there. So a turtle, I mean, for the Americans was a total insult. So they had to, this was back in September, and they had to do something about it. So we come back a little bit, and George Low, who's an engineer at NASA, had this idea to bring people around the moon by December, and it was a crazy idea. NASA wasn't ready. They didn't really know how they were going to pull this through, and they worked very hard, of course, to do it. And with that, I forgot what I wanted to say. So there's good old George. And here I'd like to present to you, of course, the crew. So there's Borman. Borman was the commander, and I'm going to present him sort of like the bad guy, the party pooper. But you have to understand that he had a very important mission. He was in charge of everything, and he really wanted to make people to come back safely. And so it was sort of tough with him. But he had a lot of responsibilities, and he was a good man. Jim Lovell actually wasn't supposed to be there. Mike Collins was supposed to be there. And Mike had a spine problem, a spine spur, and that he had to have operated. So he was replaced by Jim Lovell. He was in charge, Jim, of the command module. And the third guy, this is funny. Jim had promised during the summer to bring his family to Acapulco. Well, they didn't do that. He was supposed to bring them in December, and that's what his family was doing in December. They were looking at the mission. Bill Anders was a lunar module pilot, and he was training on this thing alongside Neil Armstrong, actually. And as the lunar module wasn't ready, well, they weren't going to bring it along. So he was sort of angry about that. But on the other hand, going to around the moon was a good challenge for him, so he accepted. And he became the cameraman. He was the guy taking pictures. So here's the mission. Now, very briefly, could you still hear me? And is that okay? So they're gonna start here. They're gonna go twice around. Go to the moon. Go 10 times around, and it's not they could have done a free return, but they didn't do that, so they went in orbit around the moon, and then after 4 days, back to Earth. And you always think that the moon is going to be full. Well, actually it wasn't, so you can see here that it wasn't. It's the moon. It was quite an advantage because their one of their goals was to check out future lunar landing places. And so the shadow that was cast by the sun, which was behind somewhere, was interesting. It would allow them to see things better, mountains and stuff like that. So should we go on a trip? Okay, so that's the presentation. So they start on their trip here, and they come back over here. Okay? So, I'm sorry I sprained my ankle, so we thought it would be a nice way to do the presentation. So, as you saw, there was a fancy Saturn V in the entrance, but I built my own. I thought I'd present this like a little kinder show and tell thing, because that's what children would do in the 70s and the 60s. So we have on the 21st of December at 7:51, it's takeoff. So here we go. So it's takeoff 2 minutes later, 2.5 minutes later. And I'm really not good at numbers, so please excuse me. First stage comes off. And then this thing comes off, and I stuck it earlier on so that it wouldn't fall. So this is the security. Escape tower. Thank you very much. Thank you, Claude. So that comes off too. Don't need it anymore. And then after 8 minutes, stage 2 comes off, and they're left with stage 3 and the command module, and you have a command module here and the service module here. And there they are in orbit. So they're going to go 2 times in orbit, sorry. So that works out. 2 times, and I'm not going to do it 2 times, and I'm not going to go 10 times around that. Okay. And then after, this is a funny thing that I hadn't understood before. So there's a separation here. They're going to go into, where's my note? Translunar Injection. Sorry, that's. So they go, which means it's the first time that they're going to boost something to go out of the orbit of the Earth and towards another object. So this is blasted here, 3rd stage. After, they had to do a rendezvous test. So you have to imagine that the lunar module would be inside here, but it's not. And so they had to do something crazy like this, and test a fake rendezvous, and that was it. Okay, and turn back. And what happens here is that actually stage 3 continues to follow the spacecraft, And Borman has to communicate with Mission Control to see how they could get rid of the thing. And if they actually had enough fuel to do so, and if it wouldn't disturb the possibility of doing a free return if ever something went wrong. So they get rid of it finally, and they go off. At that moment, Borman has slept a little bit, and he wakes up. And man, is he ever sick. This is the guy in charge and everything, and he is sick. He doesn't even have time to grab one of those poop bags, and he vomits, and he has diarrhea. It's an atrocity. It's really awful. It's that bad that Anders takes the emergency oxygen to be able to breathe. And he's not allowed to. I mean, when they were rotating around the Earth, Borman, who's really the guy in charge, he tells Anders, who's a rookie, you're not allowed to look out the window. Okay, because they had stuff to do, they had stuff. And here you have poor Borman who's sick, and it's atrocious. But Anders notices a vomit blob coming towards him like this, and pulsating. And then it separates, and that's a beautiful occasion to demonstrate the Newton's conservation of momentum. Thank you. I'm not a scientist, guys, okay? Please excuse me. So they have their first, they have these telecasts, and Borman was against these, but they have them anyhow. And so that was their, sorry, I'm not following with this. So that's the start. And here you could see Jim Lovell, who's wishing a happy birthday to his mother. During the second telecast, they actually show the Earth, which is pretty cool. And so to go from there to there, it takes 2.5 days, approximately, excuse me. And by the time they get to this point, Anders is really bored because there's not much to do. You have to imagine that when they took off, the windows got somehow dirty. They couldn't see that much. There was just two little windows that were on the side of the latch that they could see through properly. And these guys, they couldn't even see the moon. They didn't know where they were going. It was like being in a simulation for 2.5 days. I mean, what a bore. And they were on barbecue mode, which is probably might explain why Borman was sick. So that was in order to not heat up in the sun. Oops.